Everyone, and welcome to the Doctors of Running podcast, where we, a group of doctors of physical therapy, talk about the art and the science of the things you're putting on your feet, as well as what's happening in your body and what you can learn from it. So today is just going to be me solo, Matt, talking about an article that I was, after a lot of work, was very fortunate to get published in the Journal of Sports Biomechanics. And this is an area that I'm going to talk about that's very special to me. It's also very personal. And so the title of the article was Changes in Running Biomechanics in Masters Runners Over Age 50, a systematic review. And why this is special to me? Because my dissertation that I'm working on, and this, by the way, was the second chapter of my dissertation, and I've got 3 done. Hopefully going to be starting the 4th one out of 5 very soon here. The reason this was important because I have really turned my focus and a lot of my private clinical practice to working with masters runners. It's something I really am passionate about. I am, besides being an orthopedic clinical specialist, I am also a geriatric clinical specialist. And I love working with older individuals because I want to know, what's happening to our bodies, both my body and others, and what we can do about it to be able to age gracefully. It's one of those things, everybody's going to get older, right? But we need to figure out what does that mean for each one of us. So we know there are changes that happen as we get older. We know some changes a lot better than other changes, but how is that going to affect our function? And that's why I'm so interested in older individuals and aging, is because I just, like I said, want to know what's happening and what we can do about it is kind of the big key. The problem with figuring out what to do about it is, as I've gone through my dissertation work, written, now published, discovered there was not as much as I was hoping in this area, which is kind of a little disappointing because aging, right? There's lots of literature on aging. There's not as much literature on being athletic and aging. There's very basic stuff like, you need to make sure you do basic exercise, don't sit on the couch. It's like, okay, cool. For those people who actually want to still be running and working out at a high intensity, what does that mean for us? And I have a little bit of that for you. But this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this systematic review, is because, yes, there's some literature reviews on kind of what happens in the Masters Runner. There was a systematic review versus literature review is different because a systematic review is actual research on research, if that tells you how boring I am. I'm just kidding. The literature review is kind of like an expert opinion where it's like we bring some stuff together, but it's not this systematic study of what actually has been done and how do we make sure we don't miss anything. So there wasn't anything on biomechanical changes in Masters Runners. There's not very much on Masters Runners to begin with. There are a couple studies on systematic reviews on the muscle morphology changes. There's a wonderful article from McKendry et al. On muscle morphology changes, and that includes strength athletes, endurance athletes, not specific to runners, but there's some good stuff that can be gleaned from there, but nothing specific to, and certainly no consensus on masters runners. So the purpose of this, because my research is on this group, and if I want to do research, I need to have a good, stable foundation to stand on. And before I did this, how am I going to argue something about, this is change, this biomechanical change is happening, so I can look at this? I didn't have that consistently. So the purpose was to finally get a consensus in the current literature about what biomechanically happens for those of us running as we get older. So basically it was looking at research comparing younger runners to masters runners. And let me clarify one thing in just a second. And the reason I said over age 50 is because we got to define masters runners first and explain what that is. So for those who haven't heard this, I'm sure hopefully most people have, and probably the masters runners listening are going, duh. No offense. Masters runners are defined as any runner it depends on who you ask, any runner over the age of 35 to 40 who is continuing to compete in road running events, trail running events. USA Track and Field generally defines it 35 to 40. I have a problem with this because if you look at the literature on when we see the largest musculoskeletal changes, it's not 35 to 40. In fact, so you start seeing just little cues what happens when you start getting older. Age 30 is about the first time, on average, you start seeing some significant changes, not significant, but start seeing changes in the musculoskeletal system. When you're younger, you get stronger, everything's moving forward, right? It's like life is great. As you hit 30, some of that stuff starts to slow down and you're going to start seeing some changes and little declines in function. I say little because, you're still seeing 30-year-olds. That's like some of the best time for endurance athletes and some incredible masters athletes who are setting records and all this stuff. So you see a lot of elite athletes actually frequently peaking in 30s. So that's why I'm like, I don't know if you can label this fairly going, oh, okay, this group is older, like has significant changes where they need to have their own age group, right? I'm not meaning to like say, oh, you know, if you're 35, like you don't deserve your own age category. I'm not saying that. I am saying that from the evidence, a lot of the changes that you really start to see don't happen until about, on average, age 50. There's a great article by Hall, which kind of was looking at this, not in runners, but in like huge volumes of people throughout the age span. What they found was 30 is kind of the first thing that starts to happen. 50 is where this starts to accelerate. And then 75-ish is when this really starts to accelerate. And I can tell you this, and this is anecdotal, but I can also tell you this from a clinical practice standpoint, but those age periods is where you start seeing major changes. Now, you obviously want to do something about them, right? And that's where I'm coming in. And with this article is kind of trying to start some of the, what do we need to do about this? How do we maintain our function as long as possible? Can we maintain the same function we did that we were 25 over 75? Probably not, but we can at least maintain that in age as well as possible and keep moving as well as possible for as long as possible. So that's where this comes in. So I, to be honest, disagree with having 35 to 40 be the start of masters running category. I think that it should be 45, 50 based on current evidence, but I'm not the one in charge of that. That said, because I wanted to make sure I saw changes, I focused on masters runners over the age 50 and older, and then younger runners 40 and younger, because that middle group kind of like that was that transition period I was really concerned about. And you're welcome, anybody that's curious, you are welcome to see my full methodology and pick it apart, because any feedback I am more than open to. So again, that's the definition of masters runners. What happens, or at least what do we know happens as we get older? So what we do know so far, some of the stuff I told you, age 50 approximately tends to be a major time point. We do know that not specifically in runners, but we know that as you get as you get older in the general population, we tend to lose strength most significantly and muscle. Actually, let me start over. We tend to lose muscle mass most significantly in the extremities. So you tend to maintain trunk, hip function a lot better than you maintain wrist and especially calf and foot function. The calf function is something that has been studied extensively in older individuals as a risk for falls, right? Because your calf really is how you propel. It's also how your ankle strategy. It's how you really get used to or like accommodate to any kind of weird changes on your foot, i.e. it's how you maintain balance. What you don't want to have happen is if you have a small change in the surface underneath you, you don't want to have an exaggerated balance reaction because that can actually cause you to fall. You want to have a balance reaction that matches to the perturbation that you experience, right? So if you kind of slip a little bit, you should be able to like use your ankle and your calf muscles to kind of balance yourself really quickly instead of having the whole thing get involved, which can be a risk factor for falls. We do know, again, power. So I keep going the wrong way with this, and I appreciate your patience on this. So we know that overall, but especially in the extremities like calf and things like that, we tend to lose muscle mass as we get older. That's just something that happens. There's power and strength athletes tend to be able to maintain that better. They don't maintain it 100%, but they maintain it a lot better as we get older. So we lose muscle mass. We lose more muscle strength than we do muscle mass, right? So that's been fair. This is not specific to masters runners. It's just across like the general population. We also tend to lose more muscle power and power generation than we do muscle strength and muscle mass. So there's a mystery here that I'm not going to address today, that we are definitely losing function as we get older, okay? The further question is, so what does that mean, and what other changes are we seeing? So we talked about musculoskeletal stuff, or like musculoskeletal stuff you're seeing. We also know that there's a dramatic change in the injury types as we get older. So when you're younger, the more common ones you'll see, kind of the top ones, are patellofemoral or knee stuff, right? A lot of people have had some knee stuff. It's really common when you're younger. Not everyone, but a lot of people. So top ones are like knee stuff, patellar tendinopathy, patellofemoral issues, IT band stuff, shin splint, i.e. medial tibial stress syndrome, shin splints, and then Achilles stuff is down there a little bit. As you get older and you become a master's runner, this is a great study from McKean et al., found that as you get older, you tend to experience a lot more Achilles issues, which is number one, calf problems, and hamstring issues. That's not to say that you don't have knee problems. But the most common ones are Achilles number one, calf number one, two, and hamstring number three. And we have no idea why. So that's where my interest is going, okay, I'm a physical therapist. I treat injuries. Why is this happening? And we really don't know. There's some literature reviews that suggested, maybe it has to do with loss of calf strength, but we don't know that for sure. There's some kind of, I'm not going to say stereotypes, but like some commonly accepted things that happen in master runners when there's not a consensus on research. And this is where I came in. So some of the previous general evidence, not a systematic review, had suggested that master runners tend to have shorter stride lengths. They tend to have higher stride rates. They tend to obviously have a lot less bounce. They tend to be a lot more level because they're supposedly generating a lot less force. But if you look at a consensus in the literature using a systematic review, we really didn't know. So you can't really make any hypotheses because you have nothing to stand on because you're not really sure. We were not really sure what was happening as you were going from being a younger runner to a master's runner. So that's where I came in. So I did the systematic review. It took 6 months to just do the review because it was myself and my advisor, Dr. Chris Patterson over at APU, that were working on this. It's probably closer to 7-8 months. This took a lot of time and a lot of work. If you've never done a systematic review and you don't understand what it takes to do these, it's an insane amount of work of going through thousands, if not more, articles, trying to figure out what matches the inclusion-exclusion criteria, i.e. one of the components was being over age 50 and then the younger runners being under age 40, just to have something to compare, making sure the data was looking at the right stuff, and I found things all over the place. Another challenge is doing good research is really hard, and I'm really glad I did this because I am getting ready for my full study, which I'll talk about at the end here, and you got to really make sure your stuff is all in order to do this. It's hard enough to do these. It's even harder to get published. So the publishing part took me, I submitted to one journal. They said it wasn't appropriate for them because it's biomechanics, and then I submitted to Sports Biomechanics back in November of 2022. And then after going back and forth, all these revisions finally got published in June of 2023. So that's a long time. It took a long time. So please, patience with me is necessary, and realize a lot of work went into this. And these are really hard to do. So tons of studies, looked through all this stuff, read through all this stuff, found a consensus, pulled the stuff together. And what I found was kind of surprising, but also kind of not surprising. So let's go through what the basic results were, and then we'll talk about kind of what might that mean. And I'm going to be very, very careful with this because I can't make definite conclusions on, this is why we get injured. This is that. Because there's still a lot more to be done, but this is part of building the foundation to actually go, okay, this is why we do these interventions. This is an observational systematic review, meaning I'm just looking at stuff going, hey, we're just watching and seeing differences. So be careful with the conclusions you make with this. I will be careful with them. So here's the things we found biomechanically, meaning kinematics and kinetics. Kinematics is looking at motion. Kinetics is looking at forces. I didn't look at strength because there wasn't enough stuff on that, and I knew early on I wasn't going to be able to find a consensus on that stuff. So movement and forces during masters runners versus younger runner stride. What I found initially, which was a little surprising at first, was that in masters runners, the majority of studies out there found that there was no change in stride rate. So cadence. So you remember earlier, one of the things that people say, they generally have a higher cadence. That turned out to not be true on the whole, right? Maybe there might be a small population, but overall, most of the research suggests that there wasn't a change in stride rate or cadence. They generally have the same cadence as younger runners. What they have a difference compared to younger runners is their stride length tends to shorten. This is kind of known like that short stride, but that overall, that changes and gets shorter. What is weird though, and was a very strong consensus in the majority of articles I found, is that hip extension, i.e. your hip going behind you, right? That actually increases as you get older, which I would have suspected the opposite. I would have expected a loss of hip flexor mobility. I would have expected joint stiffness. I would not have expected that to increase. But although overall stride length is decreasing, hip extension decreases, which I'm assuming means that you got to lose that from somewhere. So hip flexion might be decreasing. I can't say that for sure, but we know stride length shorter, hip extension increases compared to younger runners in masters runners. So that was an interesting first thing to find. The second thing, we're starting to look at kinematics, which is forces. And I should tell you that, by the way, none of the other like joints range of motion stuff was changing. Like peak range of motion in the knee and ankle wasn't changing. And I was like, that was surprising. I was really expecting the ankle to change. The range of motion, like how much you moved, didn't change. And I was like, consistently throughout the different studies. And I was like, that's interesting. So hip seems to be the big thing, range of motion change that you see. From a force perspective, very consistently, like consensus across all the research study included, was that you have lower peak propulsive ground reaction forces. Now, in English, what that means, ground reaction forces, when you put force into the ground, a ground reaction force is all forces must have an equal and opposite force into them, right? So if that's how we measure this stuff. So if you're running over a force plate, which is typically how we do this, which I'm doing right now, when you put force into the ground, that's how the plate measures that. So it's the ground reaction. It's reacting to the amount of force you put into the ground. That's how this is measured. So propulsive ground reaction forces tend to come most strongly from the calf. There's a study by Hamner et al. Long ago, not that long, that found that a large portion of the propulsion that happens during the running gait is from the calf. So a decrease in lower peak propulsive ground reaction forces might suggest that masters runners aren't putting as much force into the ground and certainly aren't propelling themselves forward as much, which kind of makes sense because as we get older, we typically tend to slow down, right? This is a kind of a microscopic view into a much bigger thing going on, but that's kind of what it sounds like, right? So you're not pushing off as hard, essentially, in your term at the end of your gait. We also found that when we're looking at joint moments, and for those of you who don't know, moments are kind of the sum of all the forces happening around a joint, right? So generally, these tend to come mostly from muscles, although some soft tissue structures like ligaments and some other stuff can actually produce these just a teeny bit at the very end. But for the most part, it's all the sum, especially of muscle forces that are happening around a joint. So we know, and we found from this, like a significant consensus across all literature, that among the different joints, hip didn't really change, knee didn't really change, but ankle, the plantar flexion moments significantly decreased compared to younger runners. So master runners significantly decreased plantar flexion moments, and these happen most significantly during the second half of when your foot's on the ground, also called the stance phase. So as you're resisting your body collapsing, right, and your calves are kicking on and holding you off to the point where they actually push off, that whole phase, right, from like controlling your body to pushing you off, there's a significant decrease in plantar flexion moments, which again, combined with the peak propulsive ground reaction force, suggests that you're not pushing off through your ankle nearly as hard as when you're younger, which again, I'm going to emphasize the calf is the primary thing that does this. So in conclusion, there's some differences between younger and older runners. We already knew this, but this brings a better consensus as to kind of what specifically movement and force-wise is changing. It looks like your hip extension is increasing, but your calf function is decreasing. And now my hypothesis for why this might be happening is a lot of what happens at the end of your stance phase when you're pushing off affects a lot of different things. So you need to time when you push off to get adequate to start the swing phase. I.e., get your leg forward so you can start pushing off again. You can land, get back, push off again. If you're not pushing off very much, you're not going to start that phase earlier. You're not going to start the swing phase when your leg is in the air until later. So my hypothesis is that because you're not pushing off at the right time, you're not generating enough force to start that, you're actually delaying when that happens. So instead of pushing off directly under or just a little bit behind you, it's taking more time for you to push because you're not generating as much force. So your stride behind you, it's taking longer for you to get your foot off the ground. A compensation for that would be you need to extend your hip more to be able to handle that. I would suspect, although I didn't really see anybody comment on this, I would expect you to see less hip flexion because the more you push off, the more your leg tends to swing forward. I don't know if people know that. Most people think that your hip flexors are the primary thing that pull your leg forwards, but it's really a combination of your calf pushing off and a small bit of your hip flexors at the later part of you pushing off that really pull your leg forward. A lot of swing phase is not active in the way where it's not pulling you forward. Most of it is actually like a very small thing when your foot lifts off the ground, a small kick from the hip and the ankle to bring you forwards, a little bit from the knee. And then the rest of it is your body slowing down your limbs so it can handle landing. So in English, my suspicion is that it's because the master runners are losing calf function, that they have to compensate with hip extension. They probably have less hip flexion because of that, because your stride is a result of many different components. But I really suspect that masters runners are losing calf function, similar to what we've seen in the general population. So that's, if you're going to try to make some further conclusions from this, it's kind of hard, because now we need to somebody needs to look at, hey, let me measure lower extremity muscle function, muscle strength in younger versus older runners and see, is there a difference? There's been a couple studies that have kind of looked at this, not as well as I would have hoped, but I really think a large study or really needs to look at this. Now, this is not where I'm going, because that's just looking at the general masters runners. I'm more interested in looking at what is happening in terms of that injury thing I talked about earlier, because I'm a PT, I want to stay healthy. I want to keep people around me healthy. It makes it easier to treat. Because right now, I have these suspicions, but I can't make general prescriptions across masters runners, because we still aren't really sure what's happening in a function standpoint. We have some pieces, but not all of them. So if you don't have all the pieces, it's really going to be an individual basis, a case-by-case basis. You have to evaluate the individual, figure out what's driving their symptoms, and you can't make blanket stuff about the rest of the population, because we're still missing things, like I said, strength. However, I'm still going to make some hypotheses about, like I said, I think we're losing calf muscle function, which would totally make sense that Achilles tendinopathy and calf problems are the number one things that people, as they get older, are at risk for. Because guess what one of the biggest risk factors for Achilles tendinopathy is? Decreased calf function. That makes sense. There's a ton of other things. There's actually some really interesting research that fluoroquinolone antibiotics are actually a risk factor, but the big biomechanical force things is either too much dorsiflexion, too little dorsiflexion. So you can be too mobile, you can be not mobile enough. So don't assume that you should stretch this. And there's a whole other topic we have on Achilles tendinopathies and stretching. But don't assume stretching is always the answer. We definitely know that muscle strength loss in the calves really is a risk factor for Achilles tendinopathy. And I say this because I've had Achilles issues. I know a lot of masters runners have had Achilles issues. That is testimonial data until I saw the evidence many years ago as I was doing my dissertation going, oh. So if we want to keep running as we're older, and as we get older, and I'm sure master runners know this, is when you get injured when you're older, it takes longer to come back from that. And that can be really frustrating, because running is so much more than exercise. It is like something near and dear our hearts. It's part of us. It's who we are as human beings, or at least those of us who are runners. And it's really frustrating not to be able to do that. Most people have been injured. They know that big frustration. It's what motivated me to become a physical therapist, because I need to figure out how to do this, because I'm tired of having to get injured. And it's been a really great experience to be able to share that with others, help them get through these journeys. But the biggest thing is I want to know, how do we stop this from happening in the first place, or at least significantly decrease the risk of this happening? So my suspicion is decreased calf muscle function. I think that you certainly need to maintain your hip muscle function. So if I was going to give some suggestions on what to do, without enough evidence behind what I'm saying right now, it would be, you better make sure your calf muscles are strong. And that might mean doing some strength and even some jumping stuff, and ease into that. But you also need to make sure that your hips don't get stiff, because you need to be able to generate force, but also make sure you can compensate. So making sure you have enough hip extension and keeping your calf muscles strong is probably the biggest takeaways I can tell you from what I hypothesize is what needs to happen. I don't know that for sure, because we still need further evidence. But here's the other thing, and a little pitch for what I'm doing. So I am studying masters runners with Achilles tendinopathy. My study as of this point is still in the process of being approved. It should be approved any day now. It's in APU's IRB program. If you are interested, when it gets approved, at being a participant, please reach out to us. You can reach out to the Doctors Running Gmail. If you know me on Instagram, any of those places, let us know. And the key is you have to be in Southern California, close to Azusa, because that's where I'm doing all the biomechanical testing when this thing goes live. I am going to, as soon as this is approved, I'm going to try to get as many subjects as possible in there to finish this. I've done a power analysis. I need at least 30 plus people for this. So I need those who are healthy and those who have a history of Achilles tendinopathy, right? Assuming you're not doing any rehab. And if you are interested in this, don't start doing what I just said, going, oh, I need to do calf strength and all that stuff, because that's going to impact the stuff. Just be who you are, be natural. And I'm looking to see, like, compare those and figure out kind of what is there any influence further on a couple additional variables that I'm not going to talk about yet, on what may be influencing some of these changes in Masters runners. So if you're interested, you're in the Southern California area, please reach out to us. I would love to have you. The study has not been approved yet, so hopefully by the time this is released, it'll be approved and I'll start data collection. But feel free to reach out to us. I really love this. And again, Doctors Running started as a teaching tool. I was kind of frustrated that I was in running stores and I was getting into physical therapy and I didn't see a lot of stuff that was really consensus driven and evidence based. And Doctors Running has been really an attempt to bring more evidence and research into the general population to help you make better decision with footwear. But also we're going to start reaching into how do we keep you healthy, right? And there's a lot of stuff out there. A lot of complicated stuff. And our job is to keep this really simple. There's enough stuff out there. Just like me, I like simple. My students know this. I like to keep things simple because the more complicated, yes, life is complicated, but through that complexity to find out common themes of how to address some of this stuff, because we just want to keep moving. We just want to run, as all the shoes you see behind me, I just want to go for a run. I don't want to get interrupted. I don't have to overthink things, which still happens. So I appreciate you coming on this journey, and I hope that was helpful. So this is what my study, my systematic review found, and I hope that was helpful. If you are interested in helping me out, and participating in not only helping me out, but helping the entire group of master runners in certainly the world figure out what's changing and why some kinds of injuries might be a little more common, let us know. I'm also really curious if you have anything else we would want us to review, because as we're going through footwear stuff, we are PTs. We're interested in biomechanics. We're interested in forces, strength, and all that stuff. So I'm hoping to continue doing this because I want to teach all of you how not only to keep healthy footwear choices, but also how to stay healthy. Because I'm in one of the rare professions where I want people to stay healthy and not need me, right? I'm very lucky to be a PT, and people are always getting injured. If we can decrease that and improve people's function, that's part of the preventative aspect that the American Physical Therapy Association really emphasize is part of our scope. So I appreciate you sticking around. Hope that was helpful. We'll have more research stuff soon, especially as they get published, but that's probably not going to be anytime soon because I still got more research to go. But I appreciate you listening to stuff. Hope it was helpful. If you have any comments, as always, please leave stuff in the comment section wherever you're listening or viewing this. I do realize for those of you watching this on YouTube that I keep moving my computer and jostling, so thanks for tolerating that. Have a wonderful evening, day, time, whatever you're doing, and thanks for listening, and we will catch you soon.